global challenges into opportunities. China in 2017. Well, you've really forced me to turn this around, because usually when I do this talk to business leaders, they want to hear all about the doom and gloom. What could go wrong? What should they worry about? What do they tell their boss back in headquarters? And why their budget should be lower this year. So I've got to turn this around. Turn it around in two ways. Certainly to talk about the opportunities, I'm delighted to do that. But generally when I talk about China, and sort of what's coming up, I've started by talking about domestic and working outwards. I think where we are right now, we really have to talk about externalities and then work back in. Because I think if we think about opportunities for China in 2017, I think one of the individual who's seen already that 2017 is a year of fantastic opportunity is Xi Jinping. And his agility in deciding to go to Davos and talking there and taking what I would call the high ground in the speech that he gave of occupying the space that had been left, and this is the theme I'll come back to, the space that had been left by US politicians and business leaders stepping back and saying, we're going to be the champions of free trade. We're going to be the champions of globalization. And getting the Western liberal media to pick up and say, isn't this wonderful and amazing, and can't understand it. Those of us back here on the ground might say that there's a slight tension between rhetoric and reality, but nonetheless taking the high ground. And I think we're going to see numerous other occasions this year when Xi Jinping, the Chinese government leadership, takes the high ground in relatively straightforward and easy ways, which fundamentally enhance China's positioning as a global leader and as a responsible global leader. To give you a few examples. United Nations peacekeeping. It's not well known, but China's already one of the largest contributors to UN peacekeeping forces around the world. And in December last year, China had 2,600 troops on active duty in peacekeeping around the world. The United States had 72. China's committed 8,000 troops to the emergency standby peacekeepers. That's 20% of the total. They've also committed $1 billion to the UN's Peace and Development Fund. That's one. Belt Road. Our friend from DBS has run away, so he can't argue with me anymore on this. I think it is a lot more than a slogan. There's going to be a summit in Beijing in May, where Merkel's going to be there, Putin's going to be there, there's going to be probably 30 global leaders there. The topic of conversation is the development of Belt Road infrastructure, China building infrastructure for the world, not China building infrastructure for China. Even with the European Union, it'll be about integrating the European Union's integration development plan, it's called the Juncker plan, with Belt Road. And so that in Eastern Europe, there'll be combined projects going forward. China taking the high ground, China collaborating. There's going to be a Brussels summit. There was no plan. Xi Jinping hasn't been to Brussels ever, I don't think. But now he's going. And what he's going to be talking about is global again, the DBS guys ran away, sorry. Global banking re-regulation. It's going to be about China and the EU stepping up and say, what do we want the next wave of global banking regulation to look like? It's creating an opportunity for China no longer to be the receiver of banking regulation set by Basel, Washington, New York, London, but to shape it to its own purposes. And the rest of the world, if it's not careful, will find we're embarking on a path where China and Chinese financial regulators are defining elements of regulation for the rest of the world. Support for free trade agreements in Asia. We've heard about border taxes in the US. China, and this is in active discussion with the EU, China's thinking about putting it into action is probably a long way off, but even just talking about something called a carbon border adjustment tax, which would be a tax on the carbon content of products and services coming from any country that has said they're not going to live up to their Paris commitments. There's only one country that said they're not going to live up to their Paris commitments at the moment, and they have a new president. And then if you want to get a little bit more up close and personal about it, we could take the high ground on ethics and say Chinese government and state-owned enterprises are not allowed to work with any businesses associated with the leader of a foreign country. So they can't stay at the Trump Hotel. And you can go on and on. But the point I want to make is I think China 2017 is a year of fantastic geopolitical opportunity for China in the positive. We hear a lot about the negative trade wars and all that kind of thing, none of which has happened yet. And there are many ways to take the high ground for China, and I'm seeing tons of evidence that that's the path that they're looking on going down. China's economic situation, business situation in 2017, clearly coming from the political side of things, the intent is to be really boring in China's economy this year. Success is stability, no crises, no confrontation, keep using the same levers, pump credit into the economy, lock up a few more businessmen. We'll have excess capital, we'll have slightly rising inflation, and as DBS said, we'll have lower real interest rates. So where's the growth going to come from? Growth is a source of opportunity. Looking at business leaders in China, you often end up asking yourselves the question of, were they lucky, were they good, or were they criminal? And there's an awful lot that were lucky, of being in the right place at the right time. It'd be really tough. You could be Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and whoever else squared. If you were trying to run a coal mining industry in northwest China today, you'd be hard put to make money. Being in the right place at the right time. Where's the right place to be? Looking about China outbound, I would amplify some of what we heard earlier, that it could be a pretty solid year for net exports out of China. Probably not for basic materials and steel, but for the more value-added goods. And let's remember, the US is less than 20% of China's exports. The US is less than 20% of China's exports. There's still a lot of the rest of the world to go after, even if it becomes trickier to sell to China. And the people who are doing really well are the people who are working to shorten their supply chain out of China. Today, and I get exposed to a lot of the air cargo business, volumes in some of the work that I do. Air cargo out of China is doing fantastically well right now, because what people want is, using internet ordering and the like. You customize the product, it's assembled to order in China, and then put on the plane and gets to you 2-3 days later. China has the value-added manufacturing capability to do this kind of mass customization, whether it's in electronics or B2B industrial side of things as well. There's going to be, and there are many ways in which that center of excellence, the center of capability, a lot of which is just an hour up the road in Shenzhen, is growing, is becoming stronger, and Chinese companies that 5 years ago just made to order 1 million units as long as they were all red, have developed new skills and capabilities and are growing and becoming much more profitable as a result. I do think we'll need to be ready for discontinuities. We do need to think about how, if we have to segregate our supply chain of supplying from China to non-US markets and supplying into US markets, how we do that. And the most agile player in an industry is going to be the one who comes out best. In PCs today, everyone makes the vast majority of their PCs in China. So whether Dell or HP or Lenovo or Apple adapts to what may come, is ready to adapt better to what may come down the road in terms of border taxes in the US, is an opportunity. The industry may do worse, but someone relative to their competitors will do much better. Outbound M&A is absolutely going to, I think this is going to be a more mature year for M&A coming out of China. 2016, I think we saw a lot of fluff, noise, what do you want to call it? Vanity project M&A. Buying a soccer team in the UK, particularly buying a second-tier soccer team in the UK, is not a way to create value. It's a way to, whatever, get money out of China at best, because you probably won't get it back. And as I forecast in some of my things, I think some of them are going to find that their fan base, when they get relegated, turns on the owners, and that's going to be an interesting experience for these Chinese entrepreneurs to have 30,000 British soccer hooligans shouting at them. So I think there's going to be much more strategic M&A this year, and that will still be allowed. It is still clearly going forward today, whether it's about banks buying banks, whether it's about pharmaceutical products companies buying pharmaceutical products, whether it's about tech companies, ag companies buying in their industries outside China. And what's changing is that the leadership of these companies is becoming much more global ready and global confident. And their ability to say, that management team is underperforming. You know, they're really not doing this operations supply chain thing very well. And to intervene, to replace, and to upgrade management. 4 or 5 years ago, until very recently, Chinese acquirers were very, very hesitant to intervene in the operational performance of the companies. They didn't feel they had the leaders didn't feel they had the experience to second guess, to say the people that running this company we acquired aren't really up to it. And they have more, now the Chinese company has more and more internationally experienced execs at the top, at the middle, and people who've come in out of global business schools into these private Chinese companies and making their careers there. And that's really changing the game, whether it's what Shanghui's done in the pork industry in the US, what Lenovo's done, what several others have started to do in bringing Chinese internationally capable executives into top global positions. Yep, there's going to be some, it's not going to be all super and perfect. There will be some failures. And I think some of the SunPower retail investments, probably going to look pretty challenged. Huawei paid an awful lot of money for the GE white goods business. We'll see how that goes. But more majority acquisitions, more strategic, good opportunities there. Domestically within China, consumption was the key driver of growth for the last, if China grew 6.5 points last year, consumption contributed 5 points of that growth. A lot of that was due to the wealth effect of property prices going up, good real income growth, low inflation, low fears over job security. 2017 is not quite as good a year. It's almost certain that property prices aren't going to go up. It's almost certain that real income growth is going to be the lowest it's been in a decade. There's more inflation. Stock market, by the way, it's a very odd stock market crash that we heard about earlier when a very significant proportion of companies in the stock market today are still on a PE of 80. Okay, they were at 120 before, but we're still at a pretty inflated level in many parts of the Chinese stock market. So people aren't putting more money into the stock market, so people don't really know where to put the money to invest. And they're not going to be feeling wealthier, and their cash flow is not really going to be going up. So I'll come back to where the opportunities come in that in a moment. But you're going to have to be more specific, more targeted to find where consumer spending is going to grow. Demographics is also playing through. Let me give you an example. The beer industry today. The top 3 domestic brewers in China have about 50-60% market share. Somehow they're all financially stressed at the same time. And why is that? Because they've done incredibly well focusing on the volume part of the market, focusing on heavy drinkers who buy cheap standard beer. the demographics is the issue. The people who drink a lot of that kind of beer in China are getting old. They're retiring. Two things happen when you retire. One, you have less money to spend, and two, you tend to drink slightly less. And so just the core demographic of that group is aging out of the market. And younger people are coming in. The market's far fewer of them. They drink premium beer, which the big three Chinese brewers haven't worked out how to get to, how to sell, or they're drinking wine. So there's $500 million of Australian wine got imported into China last year. That's a great opportunity. So looking for the demographic shifts, and the aging demographic shift is really starting to play through pretty aggressively now. The urban population over 50 is about 250 million, and is growing well over 20% a year. So their needs, what they spend on, is clearly a big opportunity, whether it's in medical services, whether it's in leisure and entertainment services, where the people over 50 are spending their dollars is really an opportunity. 2017 should be a strong year for births. Still brings the number up from a pretty low level. I think if we're lucky this year, China will have half as many births as India. But this is a lucky year for births, so I think we'll probably see a good boom there. Retail opportunities. One of the big growth areas in retail in China is inbound cross-border e-commerce. Reached $70 billion last year. People in China going to the US website or the European website or the Hong Kong website saying, I know I can get the genuine product if I go there, and I can also get it cheaper. There's a VAT arbitrage, and there's also just a pricing arbitrage. If you look at the price, if you've got half an hour, go look at the price for, say, toys on a company's website in the US, and look at the price for the same toys on the website in China. China's probably going to be 40–50% higher on average. So that's a real growth area. It's a question whether it's actually going to increase the profit pool, but for the companies selling the products, but it's definitely going to grow. Wealth management is an incredibly attractive area in China for the reasons I just described. People don't know where to invest their money. They're not very sophisticated about how to invest their money. They want to balance domestic and international. They don't have a great degree of sophistication or awareness about how to invest internationally, whether it's Credit, whether it's NOAA, whether it's HSBC, DBS, Allianz. It's a sector that, because of this need, the Chinese government has opened it up very dramatically to foreign participation in the last 12 months. Foreign companies ramping up their capabilities, Chinese companies ramping up their international capabilities, partnerships, acquisitions, and the like. It's going to be an incredibly exciting year or two. There's been no barriers to entry in many ways. 5,000 hedge funds in China. Anytime there's 5,000 players in an industry in China, you know that a fair number of them are probably not very high quality. We had one or two. Well, we had the 11. What was it? The guy who got sent to jail for 5 years and fined 11 billion RMB last week. There's going to be more in that category. Other growth areas, clearly medical services, travel, leisure, entertainment. And then just to close a little bit on the business side of things, private sector investment has been depressed for the last couple of years due to people's uncertainty about where the economy is going. Because inflation's coming through now, there's a real pressure to invest, not to expand capacity, but to improve productivity, substituting capital into factories for labor. So the kind of acquisition that Midea did to buy CUHK, the robot company, last year, is going to start to pay off very, very visibly in China this year. our friend from DBS talked about all digital banks. Let's talk about how that applies in China. It's an incredible advantage to be the attacker in China when you're competing against state-owned enterprises, because they don't have the ability to respond. You know, ICBC has more than 1 million people working in branches. Do you think they can go to an all-digital model? Not anytime soon. They have to keep those people. Ali exploited the lack of regulation, took advantage of it, begged forgiveness later, by which time they're serving millions of customers at scale, and it's hard to wind it back. I think, though, that there will be implications in the banking sector, that small banks in China are going to find it harder and harder to raise deposits to fund their balance sheets, harder and harder to access money even in the wholesale market to fund the balance sheet. And we're going to see small banks falling over in China in 2017. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity perhaps for a foreign bank to get an exception to getting a license by saying, I'll come in and take over this failing bank and turn it around. That would be one way in which it could happen. You know, a second is that the companies that these banks have lent money to may then need to be privatized, sold on. So there may be some distressed sales. There may be more rational prices for assets in China going forward. So there will be a lot of domestic M&A coming out of these banks feeling under pressure. Don't really have a chance to get into investment opportunities, but you know, government-driven expenditure means it will still be a strong year for infrastructure spending. Property is going to be repressed in the first half of the year, but as the economy slows down, we'll see that relaxed in the second half of the year. I think the government's going to realize to get to its 6% plus growth targets, it's going to need an extra stimulus, and property is going to be it. And as I said, Belt Road, international investment and infrastructure is going to really be at scale. So despite politics, despite uncertainty, despite slower growth, the transformation of the economy in China continues. Yes, it could create challenge. I'd argue the biggest challenge is for the government rather than for business. And as a business, there's a myriad of opportunities. You have to be more specific, more selected, more targeted. But you can flourish in China, and you can flourish from China into the rest of the world in 2017, even more strongly than we have in the past. Thank you very much.